Hello and welcome, everybody. Happy Friday. It's Enrico E. Manalo with another episode of Intentionally Act Live. What are we going to be talking about today? Today I'm going to be talking you through some of a video that I found on Archive MC's YouTube channel, where we also got the video that Dr. Estetia Martin and I talked about a few months ago in May in an episode called Talking Race at Work. What can we learn from a 1950s debate? If you want to check that out, I'll be dropping that link and the link to the original video in the comments. So as I'm doing that, here is our first clip.
White. Irish extraction. White. Mexican. White. Irish Scotch. Negro. White. Italian descent. White. Spanish American. You know, everyone is circular. Every piece of description about a criminal, every record card, report from a penitentiary carries a racial designation. Goes along with hair color, eye color, height, weight, scars, and other marks. It's considered to be very important information. But is it really very pertinent? Is it important to know race in order to identify a person, to apprehend him? What's its relation to crime? Let's look at some of these things.
The relation to race and crime. Yeah, so one of the things that we do know in 2021 is that it is actually important to get demographic data on people. So what we're really talking about is disaggregated demographic data, and that's really useful because it helps us to understand the different experiences of different groups. And if we don't really have that data, then it's very hard to get at how we can best support people. Right? So if we are treating everybody as if they belong to the same data set, well, that's kind of a form of color blindness. And if you're not quite sure what color blindness is, it's that often people will kind of capture that in the phrase like, I don't see race. So this is the idea that we are treating everybody equally, but when we do that, we actually lose a lot of the detail, right? And one of the problems with color blindness is that there's often this embedded assumption that what's quote unquote normal is white, right? So if we're treating everybody like they are white, like if you were to treat me like I was white, then that does not acknowledge a lot of the very real differences that I experience in my life. And another problem of being colorblind is that this can kind of alienate people who are not part of that dominant group. So treating somebody who is very aware in all aspects of their life that they are not white and in some sense not considered normal as if they are, like that's kind of a stressful thing, right? So I'll tell you, this has happened to me throughout my entire life. One of my friends actually said to me, not recently, fortunately, but a long time ago, what they said was, sometimes I forget that you aren't white. Totally meant as a compliment, right? But what the feeling behind this was supposed to convey is I don't feel awkward around you. I don't feel like I have to watch myself so much around you. I trust you. I understood what my friend meant, but what I really kind of took away from that is like, aha, so there are parts of me that are not being seen, and maybe that's a problem. So in retrospect, I really think that that has been a problem. And I'm sure that for a lot of people who will watch this video, they'll find that's the same. So if you do have experiences like that, please do let us know. Moving on into the next clip.
Well, this one, Italian descent. That doesn't mean a thing. Wouldn't it be a letter to describe his face structure? Wouldn't it be better to describe his complexion? But we find it white, Swedish. White, American descent. Oh, here's one. Says he's from Washington. That really is no great help. I don't suppose Washingtons are any more spectacular than Oregonians or Californians. Why do we have this sort of thing? Actually, it stems primarily from a notion that's handed down from an idea that many Americans had, that there was an Anglo-Saxon superiority, and strangers coming in were looked at as being potentially evil and criminal, and at every time. The American Indian, the Chinese, the Japanese, the Dutch, the Irish, the Jews, the Negroes, the Mexicans. These people at some time have been considered potentially criminal. It's important, I think, to recognize the fact that this hand-me-down sort of thing still continues. Some people still insist that there are these basic racial differences, that these racial differences promote criminality. They put out a barrage of propaganda, which makes other people believe. For example, in this cabinet, where we've collected thousands of illustrations of racial propaganda, we find a sign like this. It's self-explanatory. It indicates a feeling of inferiority for this particular group. Or, another little sign. It's a little more subtle, but it still conveys the notion of racial difference. It isn't only in the signs, of course. Our newspapers, unfortunately, do it. Some of the screaming headline types worse than others. For example, here's a couple of papers in which the word Negro is headlined unmercifully, without any reason, and certainly without any advantage of apprehension, is what one wants.
Yeah, so there's a lot in that little clip right there. And unless you've been kind of living under a rock, I think that you'll see a lot of parallels to our own time here in 2021. So, very recently, the United States has pulled out of Afghanistan, and now we've got an influx of Afghan refugees. If we look around at the media landscape, there are a lot of people who are very concerned about this, right? And if we think about other groups of migrants that have come in, there's often been exactly what Dr. Kelly here is talking about. People kind of painting those people as criminals, right? Certainly along our southern border with Mexico, there's a lot of this kind of discussion. Um, it's really kind of disheartening to see that this persists 74 years later. In 2021, we tend to want to think that we are so much more advanced in our thinking than they were in the 1950s. And of course, these are broad generalizations, but I have to say, watching this video made me really question that. Another thing that I wanted to talk about is this idea of competition over scarce resources. So we know that during the foundation of our country, before the foundation of our country, there were many European groups who were trying to establish colonies here. And that's something that's come through to our DNA today, right? So this country was founded on kind of trying to extract wealth and send it back to Europe. And now our economy is essentially based on extracting wealth from wherever we can get it as well. And so when we've got this idea of, oh, there's what we call zero sum thinking, right? There's only so much that we can have, and so I better get as much as I possibly can to benefit myself. This is a primary motivator of conflict. Right. So you can do this experiment. Scientists have done this also in the 50s and later on many other times. But if you were, say, to see a group of kids playing, maybe they're playing tag, and you divided them into two groups and then gave them a prize or tempted them with a prize, then you would see that their behavior changes almost instantly. So this is the basis of something that people in my field, conflict resolution, would call realistic conflict theory. And it's the craziest thing about it, or the most surprising thing about it, I should say, excuse me, is that the the other party doesn't even have to really exist, and neither does the prize. Even just the suggestion of other groups and the suggestion of a scarce resource is enough to prime people for conflict. So if we think about that, and we start looking around at all the different things in our lives. Maybe we're competing for a promotion, or we are trying to get the best concert tickets, or whatever. There's a lot of unnecessary conflict that could be avoided by simply kind of stepping back and saying, really? Is this thing zero sum? And I think what we'll often find is no, no, not really. And this is kind of how I view that phrase that people like to throw around when they're talking about immigrant groups a lot, which is they're stealing our jobs. So I live very close to Silicon Valley. I live in Oakland, California, and there are a lot of people on H-1B visas. Um, Unless there are millions of Americans who are, trained in the same things that many of these H-1B people are, then those jobs would not go to the H-1B holders. They would probably go to Americans if they applied for them. So, a little bit of critical thinking can go a long way here is the point that I'm trying to get at. The other thing that I want to mention here is something that we call fundamental attribution errors, right? So this is a way of kind of dehumanizing one another. And it can appear in a lot of different ways, right? So one of the things that happens with many immigrant groups is dehumanization and the fundamental attribution error of hypersexualization or attributes indicating violence. These are different types of both macroaggressions and microaggressions. And some of the ones that I've seen um, in my time studying conflict in Ecuador in a program put on by my former professor, Dr. Jeffrey D. Pugh at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. It's called Conflict Transformation Across Borders, and it's run out of Quito, Ecuador. So one of the migrant issues in Ecuador has been there have been a lot of Colombian migrants that have crossed the border. So some of you might be aware that Colombia has had problems with various organizations, like FARC is a major one. And so that's driven a lot of migration across that border into Ecuador. And it's kind of at a state where if people even hear Colombian accents, like let's say that you are, oh, this is a real case that somebody was telling me about, a student at the university where I was based. He mentioned to me that he was applying for apartments, and what he noticed is that when he would speak to the landlords and they heard that he was Colombian, he wouldn't get the apartment. So he started going to visit various prospective places with a friend, and he wouldn't say a word. He would just kind of nod along and let his Ecuadorian friend do the talking. And eventually he was able to sign the lease on a place. But, just shortly after he did that, he went to a bar to celebrate and sat down next to a woman who had her purse on the bar next to her. And as soon as she kind of picked up on the fact that he was Colombian, because he was chatting with his friend he just gotten the apartment with, she picked up her purse and she moved it to the other side. And the other thing that I mentioned was hypersexualization. So hypersexualization is something that often is attributed to women of certain groups. And one of the perceptions that we saw and were told about in Ecuador was that Colombian women were seen as being, well, hypersexual, right? So there's a certain sexuality that was ascribed to them that they were not, frankly, displaying. And I think if you dig deep, you'll see that there are populations within the United States where these things are very much in effect. One of the examples that does come to mind is the film The Birth of a Nation. And this is one of the earliest examples that we see recorded of this happening. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, the plot, and I haven't seen the whole thing, but the general plot seems to be there is a white woman whose virtue is at risk due to a black man. And if you watch the Netflix documentary, the 13th, they cover this quite extensively. So if you haven't seen that, I do encourage you to watch it. Um, And if you'd like to check out the episode that Jeff and I did together, then please do check out the link that I'm posting in the comments now. In the workplace, this kind of fundamental attribution error often comes through as culture fit, right? So that's often based on stereotypes and is used as a conscious and unconscious excuse not to include certain people in many organizations. So culture fit is a very real thing and definitely important to building your team. But when we are thinking about excluding somebody because of culture fit, it's really worth our while to kind of think through what exactly does that mean, right? So if we're thinking culture fit, we might consider things like personality, work style, all kinds of many valid factors. But if we can't really define what those factors are, then maybe we should investigate to see whether or not race plays a part of it. And if not race, maybe other ways of, well, othering people. So, for example, if it's a highly male dominated organization, then maybe when we're thinking culture fit, what we're really asking is this person one of the boys, right? And as you can easily imagine, if the person in question that's being kind of evaluated for culture fit is a woman, well, that becomes a problem very quickly. So, reinforcing these ideas of stereotypes and kind of attributing characteristics to different people based on our own concepts, often linked to fighting over scarce resources, a lot of these things kind of reinforce each other and can be precursors, excuse me, to things like violence or even genocide, right? So we know this through discourse analysis of propaganda put out by Nazis from the conflict between Hutu and Tutsi. We see this in language often used to describe Armenians, Uyghurs, and even Yemenis. So, if your focus is mostly on the US, you might not be aware of some of these things, but I highly encourage you to look them up. So to learn more about how language to learn more about how language that dehumanizes and can lead to violence or other genocide, I've got a couple links for you here in the comments as well. So one of the pieces that I was really looking at was written by a man named Kennedy Ndahiro for the New Times, which is in Rwanda, right? And it talks specifically about the Hutu and the Tutsi conflict. So please do check that out. All right. So the headlines that Kelly's talking about here, there's an article by a man named Isaac J. Bailey for NeimanReports.org. And I'd like to walk you through a quote that I found. So here we go. Journalism has not been immune to the phenomenon, with research showing that female politicians are treated differently in news stories and by voters from male politicians, while Black families are overly associated with crime and Muslims with terrorism by media outlets convinced they treat every group fairly. Studies such as the one in Political Research Quarterly have found that stories in which the candidates running are only women, the focus is more often about character traits and less often about issues. Researchers at the University of Alabama found that terror attacks committed by Muslims received 357% more coverage than attacks committed by others. So, if you do end up reading this article, I think it'll clear up a lot of the confusion around how this stuff actually happens. So, pivoting back to our videos.
What about this racial thing? If we take any book, even the simplest kind, a little pocket book, we'll find a pretty adequate description of different classifications of race. For example, in here is one from the famous classifier Linnaeus, who classifies Americanus. He adds, that's the American Indian, they're tenacious. Europeus, he's lively and inventive. Asiaticus, he's stern and stingy. And Afar, or African, he's cunning, stupid, and negligent. This is interesting, you see. Linnaeus made a classification on the basis of skin color and then adds his own opinionated adjectives. Lots of people fall into that trap. If they don't, they might classify, like another one here, Caucasian or white, Mongolian or yellow, Ethiopian or black, American or red, and Malayan or brown. This is a five-fold classification, pretty frequently used, although ordinarily today most people figure it in a threefold classification.
Yeah, so this guy Linnaeus, he is credited with being the originator of what we call scientific racism. So let me show you a little bit of what he's talking about here. Let me get the camera going. Well, so these are the kind of classifications that he's talking about, and Kelly also mentioned that it was a fivefold classification, I believe. So you can see along the first column here, Americanus, Europaeus, Asiaticus, Africanus, and along the top, this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 thing, right? So number one is skin color, medical temperament. So it corresponds to the four medieval humors. And if you're not sure what humors are, people used to believe that there were four liquids within the body that needed to be balanced for good health, right? And so that column is, you can kind of see that there's, where does it say it? Um, Yeah, so where it says, choleric, sanguine, melancholic, phlegmatic, that's related to those humors. In the second column, or the column marked 2, that's physical traits relating to hair color and form, eye color, distinctive facial traits. So if you remember in the first clip, or no, the second clip, he was talking about the kind of the shape of the Italian man's face on that sheet that he was looking at. And column 3 is behavior for manner of clothing. I'm not exactly sure what that has to do with race or biology, but okay. And 5, form of government. Yeah, so kind of really odd stuff to be attributing to biology, but again, that's going back to those fundamental attribution errors that I was talking about. And Linnaeus was publishing these things in the book that he became famous for. So that book is called Systema Naturae, published in 1758, and these categories he kind of developed in that 10th edition. All right. Whoops, not that one. Excuse me. So, mm, back on track. Okay. Yeah. So, just because something is science, and I know that that did not look scientific by today's standards, but remember that Linnaeus is a guy that kind of helped us to understand how we could classify things so that we can gain better understanding of them. Unfortunately, his classification system wasn't fantastic when it came to humans, right? So if you go back to that Neiman Reports article that I dropped in the chat before, just because it's science doesn't mean that there isn't bias, and that's something that Kelly touched on in his own words, kind of saying that, well, Linnaeus, he created these categories and then added his own opinionated adjectives. One of the places where we're seeing this show up in our day is in the field of AI, or artificial intelligence, and tech more broadly. So, technology, just like science, because it is based on science, it suffers from the biases introduced by the people who built it. And this brings us to intent versus impact. So, awareness of this fact of bias existing, it doesn't prevent harm, even if it is from scientific sources. And I have to say, this also includes DEI practitioners and activists, often who are people who have social science backgrounds. So, what exactly is it that we do? Well, one of the things that we can do to kind of keep ourselves humble is to keep learning from our mistakes and to keep moving the ball forward. So, one of the things that I'm really curious about for people who are watching is, well, what are some of the ways that you've seen bias at work? And what about in scientific or professional materials? So I gotta say that another thing that I've picked up on here is that this way of thinking, it really goes back even before Darwin and goes back at least to the Greeks. So one of the things that I'm thinking of is, one of the things that Linnaeus was kind of getting at was that the different types of humans are kind of more and less close to being animals. Of course, we are animals, but he meant animals in a way that that indicated a lack of humanity or a deficit of humanity, right? And again, one of those fundamental attribution errors that we see in the ancient world is in the statues of the ancient Greeks. So some people have pointed out that, well, the how do I say this? The endowments of the ancient Greek statues were rather modest, but this was actually tied to the idea that, say, larger endowments indicated perhaps a closer position to those animalistic traits that people see as less than human. All right, so this is a thread that really kind of runs throughout our history, and it's definitely worth us being intentional about thinking through. So again, scientific racism is very real and is actually the basis for how racism was accepted into this country as a dominant idea in the first place. Right? It was science. It must have been good. Therefore, let's base a bunch of decisions on it. One of the problems that we have today with our current technology and science is that we're moving so fast that we often don't have the time to really vet things the way that we should. So just thinking about that in your own work could probably do wonders. So back to the video.
The history of racism in our country is pretty obvious. Most people don't realize that in the early 1700s, the Negro, while he was a slave, was not considered as a lower human type. He was not segregated. He lived with a family. He got along quite well. And a great many people were opposed to slavery. As a matter of fact, there was a trend towards abolition way before the Revolutionary War. During this time, the slave lived as a sort of part of the family. He was considered an equal, although economically on a little lower scale. You know, we have an interesting thing. A couple of bowls of cotton. Probably most people wouldn't relate cotton bowls to racial prejudice. But when Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin and found out how to get the seeds out of cotton, then we suddenly found a tremendous demand for slave labor that could be worked day and night, constantly, cheaply. Right away, the Negro was pushed from his status of equality to a status of slave and shackled and leg iron. Of course, the white person had to account for this sudden shift in his treatment. He had to rationalize it. And so, to rationalize it, he simply ascribed to the Negro characteristics of stupidity, laziness, criminality, dirtiness, bad smell, and this then permitted him to treat him in a subhuman way. This pattern of racism isn't limited to our culture. For example, here is an interesting article published in Germany showing the various kinds of slavery allegedly taking place under the British imperial rule. And if you take a look at the books, you find all sorts of them around the world. For example, here's one, English, Frenchmen, and Spaniards, written by a Spaniard, which is very complimentary to the other two. And here's a dandy, The English, Are They Human? This, of course, was written by a Dutchman. And another one, I think most interesting, published in 1904, a book by a very well-educated Chinese, As a Chinaman Saw Us, in which the Chinaman complains bitterly about our body odors, and he also points out he doesn't think we'll ever make it as a culture. It's a comforting thing, I think, for Americans to recognize that there are many other countries which are just as good at slinging slurs as are we in the United States. For example, here's one. Trust a snake before a Jew before a Greek, but never trust an Armenian. And here's another one. The Germans gorge and swill themselves to poverty, disease, and hell. Trust a German as you would a dog. And here's a final one. Thievish as an American, drunk as a Pole, vindictive as a Corsican, tricky as a Greek. This whole book is a dictionary of such slurs. This brings us to a remote link between race and national origin, or actually the problem in relation of prejudice in relation to crime. To give us some understanding of this background and link, I'd like to have our announcer, Bill Trieste, describe some pictures we took of typical American scenes.
Yeah, so a lot in that clip. At the first part of that clip, he's talking about statistics and how there are people who kind of simply ignore the full picture, or they do what's called cherry picking. That's like they just pick and choose the parts of the statistics that support their point without really contextualizing it. And I bring this up because we are very much in the middle of a misinformation crisis. And so it's kind of startling to see that even in 1957, uh, we could see that there was a growing awareness of people doing this. And it's been 74 years. We've gotten more sophisticated, but unfortunately, we've also become more sophisticated at doing that very thing. And we see it so often that it's often very difficult for us to kind of cut through the noise and get to what the real picture is. So this is also kind of a sampling bias. And yeah, a sampling bias is when you're kind of picking and choosing the parts that work best for you. So climate change is one example that we're seeing a lot of this, right? So there are people who say that they don't believe that global warming is a real thing because where they live has not gotten hotter, right? And kind of conveniently ignoring the fact that it's global warming, not where you live warming. So if you encounter things like this at work, or people are throwing around statistics at work, especially in the age of big data, I think is very, very worth our while to be looking into what exactly that means, and also who collected that data and why. Super, super important, right? People measure things for all kinds of reasons, not all of them benign. Not all of them neutral. In fact, I know as a conflict resolution practitioner that being neutral is incredibly, incredibly different not different, excuse me, difficult. And it's something that we really need to practice, or something that we can aspire to. But if we're being truly neutral, then I'm not quite sure that that is possible or even desirable if it is possible. Right. So back to the Nielsen article that I keep mentioning. Right. So that's the quote that I meant to say now instead of earlier. But yeah, disparate treatment also shows up in job applications with black sounding and white sounding names on resumes that are otherwise identical on dating sites and in choices people make on Airbnb. So if you're unaware of this Airbnb thing, what they're really talking about is sometimes people become aware that applicants to or people who want to rent out a certain Airbnb might be of a certain race, and so they might be denied the ability to do so because of the prejudices that somebody who is renting the place out might hold. So it's been detected in housing decisions that have led to increased segregation. So if you're familiar with redlining, then that's certainly the case. In the story that I shared a little bit earlier about the person that I met in Ecuador, of who was Colombian and had crossed the border to try to get away from what was happening in Colombia, that's very, very much the case. So one of the case studies that we always look at in conflict resolution is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Right. And one of the things that we've learned from that conflict in particular is that when there is external conflict, then this often promotes greater in group cohesion. So that means that when there's a problem on the outside, suddenly all the problems on the inside become less important. And at that time, everybody becomes one of us, right? So you could see this definitely in the rhetoric that's used around the American wars that have been taking place over the past couple decades, right? So things like we support our troops, and it's great to support the troops, but it's kind of seen as, well, you're not American if you are against, say, the war in Afghanistan. So these are things that many people in power are very aware of and leverage, often to our deficit, unfortunately. But what we do see is that this isn't working so well in our own country, partly because we're a very, very diverse nation. But this also does mean that Americans are prone to being othered if they are not white. So there's that bar of normalcy again, right? And as an example, Sikhs and Muslims after 9/11, and currently we've got Asian people and the spiking hate crimes against them under coronavirus. So political language again plays a role. If we look back to the Oklahoma City bombing, that was definitely an act of terrorism, but is qualified by the word domestic terrorism. Somehow it's less scary if it's domestic. Still a bomb, still killed a lot of people, right? So in going back to that political language piece, Osama bin Laden, if we look back to his role in the conflict between US and USSR, also in Afghanistan in the 80s, he was really framed as a freedom fighter in our newspapers. And I'd encourage you all to look that up. However, after 9/11, he was considered a terrorist. So, same person doing the exact same kinds of things, just to different people. And because of that, how we categorized him became very different. And of course, each one of those things carries its own baggage. Freedom fighter is a positive thing, whereas terrorist is not. I think it's also worth mentioning that in the early days of our own nation, it was us, the Americans, who were considered to be terrorists by the British Crown. If we think back to the Boston Tea Party, that was very much considered an act of terrorism. Of course, not on the same scale that we understand terrorism to be able to operate today, but yeah, very much so. Another thing to note about the Boston Tea Party that often gets glossed over is these were white people in red face pretending to be native or indigenous people who destroyed property to protest taxes. So another example of intent versus impact, right? People trying to do something they thought was good, but in a way that negatively impacted people of color while galvanizing the British population. It's also worth noting that Crispus Attucks, who was an African man or an enslaved African man, was the first victim of that conflict. Whew. So that's a lot. Let's dip our toe into a little more.
The history of racism in our country is pretty obvious. Most people don't realize that in the early 1700s, the Negro, while he was a slave, was not considered as a lower human type. He was not segregated. He lived with a family. He got along quite well. And a great many people were opposed to slavery. As a matter of fact, there was a trend towards abolition way before the Revolutionary War. During this time, the slave lived as a sort of part of the family. He was considered an equal, although economically on a little lower scale. You know, we have an interesting thing. A couple of bowls of cotton. Probably most people wouldn't relate cotton bowls to racial prejudice. But when Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin and found out how to get the seeds out of cotton, then we suddenly found a tremendous demand for slave labor. Labor that could be worked day and night, constantly, cheaply. Right away, the Negro was pushed from his status of equality to a status of slave and shackled and leg iron. Of course, the white person had to account for this sudden shift in his treatment. He had to rationalize it. And so, to rationalize it, he simply ascribed to the Negro characteristics of stupidity, laziness, criminality, dirtiness, bad smell, and this then permitted him to treat him in a subhuman way. This pattern of racism isn't limited to our culture. For example, here is an interesting article published in Germany showing the various kinds of slavery allegedly taking place under the British imperial rule. And if you take a look at the books, you find all sorts of them around the world. For example, here's one, English, Frenchmen, and Spaniards, written by a Spaniard, which isn't very complimentary to the other two. And here's a dandy, The English, Are They Human? This, of course, was written by a Dutchman. And another one, I think most interesting, published in 1904, a book by a very well-educated Chinese, As a Chinaman Saw Us, in which the Chinaman...
Oops, sorry about that. That was the wrong clip. Um, yeah, so when we're talking about kind of pre-revolutionary abolitionism, I think that Yeah, I wasn't able to find too much about the equality that he was talking about, but there were some pre-abolitionary thinkers, certainly, often found in Quakers. So, Benjamin Lay and Anthony Besnet were Quakers who condemned slavery. And other Quakers at the time were also protesting slavery on the basis of the Golden Rule. So, treating others how you would want to be treated, which is, kind of informed contradictions to their religious beliefs. Today, the evolution of the golden rule, of course, is the platinum rule. So treat others how they want to be treated, not how you want to be treated, because that kind of projects some of your own wants and feelings onto other people, which is frankly not equitable. There was also a writer named Samuel Sewell who wrote The Selling of Joseph around the same time. So that's like, yeah, 1700s or so. When he's talking about Cotton and Eli Whitney, I think it's worth noting that what he's getting at is creating economic incentives to extract labor from enslaved Africans as a whole kind of category of people. So it's that cotton gin was invented around the same time that the Industrial Revolution was going on. So that's 1760 to 1840. And what we see there is kind of the confluence of the Protestant work ethic and prosperity doctrine. If you don't know what that is, that's the idea that essentially getting rich is a good thing in the eyes of God. Again, kind of part of that Protestant religion in the US. And what this did was it kind of helped people to align economic and religious or cultural beliefs toward oppression, which is had a huge impact on American culture and society. So to show you what I'm kind of talking about, I'm going to go to a quote that comes from Thomas Piketty. Thomas Piketty and Gabriel Zuckman, of course. And this comes from their paper Capital is Back, Wealth Income Ratios in Rich Countries, 1700 to 2010. So, essentially it's saying that there's so much land that is almost worthless, implying that it was difficult to be really rich by only owning land. However, the landed elite could be rich and control a large share of national income by owning the labor force. In the extreme case where a tiny elite owns the entire labor force, the total value of the slave stock can, in principle, be very large, say as large as 20 years of national income, assuming the labor share is 100% of output and the rate of return is equal to 5%. In the case of antebellum US, that is before the Civil War, the situation was less extreme, but the value of the slave stock was still highly significant. By putting together the best available estimates of slave prices and the number of slaves, we have come to the conclusion that the market value of slaves was between 1 and 2 years of the national income for the entire US and up to 3 years of income in southern states. So when we add up the value of slaves and the value of land, we obtain wealth income ratios in the US South, which are relatively close to those of the old world. Slaves across approximately compensate the lower land values. So figures 11 and 12. And I've got figure 12 for you right here, actually. All right. So as we can see in the final two columns are the U.S. South and the U.S. North. And the first two columns are UK and France. So if we take away this kind of stripy area, that one's, enslaved Africans, especially in the U.S. South, yeah, it's not even close to the UK and France. But with it, it's not exactly a competitor, but it's very close behind. And certainly, when you add these two things together, the final two columns, and you can see that it is much closer to the UK or France at the time. So I it's really it's kind of mind blowing to get a grip on exactly how profitable it was to extract labor from enslaved people. And we love to think of ourselves as the richest country on earth, but there are very real reasons for that happening. And the deeper we dig into exactly how that happened, I think the more we'll get to understand why we do certain things the way that we do today. All right. So I don't think that we would be flying around the world trying to extract oil from everywhere and doing things that mostly benefit us if we hadn't had so much early success in doing it. So when Dr. Kelley here is talking about people rationalizing things, one of the things that we know from the field of behavioral economics is that people rationalize their actions after the fact, not before. And rationalization is kind of the counterpart to reflection, right? So, reflection is something that you are examining what happened and why, often internally, and the part that you played in making that happen. Whereas rationalization creates a narrative that justifies whatever the action was. And this is often a finer line than people realize. And it's a very common trap for people to fall into. And certainly it's one that we encounter often when we are talking to various client groups. And if I'm being real here, none of us are immune to it. So this is not me pointing the finger and saying that certain people are bad and certain people are not, but more highlighting the fact that this is something that we can all be paying more attention to. Okay, so
And here's a final one. Thievish as an American, drunk as a Pole, vindictive as a Corsican, tricky as a Greek. This whole book is a dictionary of such slurs. This brings us to a remote link between race and national origin, or actually the problem in relation of prejudice in relation to crime. To give us some understanding of this background and link, I'd like to have our announcer, Bill Trieste, describe some pictures we took of typical American scenes.
Yep. Sorry about the clips here, everybody. But yeah, I wanted to focus in on the thievish as an American piece, right? So I mentioned before that in the early days of the US, it was actually the Americans who were considered to be terrorists. But another thing that we have forgotten is that early on, the US was kind of seen as a nation of pirates, actual pirates, and people who are stealing intellectual property. So, in our own day, we often talk about how in China we see people kind of taking things that are inventions or intellectual property elsewhere, and if not straight up copying it, really adopting it in ways that seem very, very similar. Um, but it's worth mentioning that, yes, Americans were very much seen in the same light not that long ago, in fact. Right. So we've got an article here. The upstart nation was a den of intellectual piracy. One of its top officials urged his countrymen to steal and copy foreign machinery. Across the ocean, a leading industrial power tried in vain to guard its trade secrets from the brash young rival. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the rogue nation was the United States. The official endorsing thievery was Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton, and the main victim was Britain. How times have changed. Now, the United States accuses China of the very sort of illicit practices that helped America leapfrog European rivals 2 centuries ago and emerge as an industrial giant. So, if you'd like to check that article out, that's Paul Wiseman for AP, and I'm dropping that link in the comments here. There we go. So, one of the things that I'd like to hear from anybody who's out there watching this video is there are stereotypes that reinforce racism, right? And in the chat, what are the stereotypes that you'd most like to see disappear from our popular and national cultures, right? So, to kind of put this the other way or another way, kind of relating this back to work, how have you seen stereotypes impact what happens in the workplace? And what industry is that in? All right, moving on.
This is a typical street in one area of a major West Coast city. Some people call it Boogie Town. Others call it, more politely, the Negro section. A few call it a disgrace. Here on streets like this live most of the Negroes of the city, locked in by invisible but clearly defined boundaries. Almost every city in America is dotted by such sections, areas populated by people of a particular race or national origin. Segregation of this sort has been declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court of the United States, but it persists, finding its strength in cultural and economic patterns. The members of the minority groups are helpless. Their fight against segregation has brought few concrete results. Despite the plainly worded decisions of the Supreme Court against discrimination in employment, in voting, in housing, the practice continues. Children are deprived of opportunities afforded to children of the majority groups. They're forced to find their fun where they can, quite often in substandard conditions and without a chance to mix with youngsters from other racial or national origin groups. Frequently, there is little or no intercourse with children of other skin color or with different-sounding names. In their schools, they meet and mix with children like themselves. Seldom, if ever, do they work with or play with or learn something about the other kind of kid. Their world becomes a narrow world, bounded by the color of skin or the sound of names. Their formal education is generally good, but their social education is limited by rigid neighborhood patterns. And when they grow to adulthood, that social education isn't broadened. Their employment, their recreation, even their everyday chores such as shopping, are marked by varying kinds of discrimination. Invisible, perhaps, but ever present.
Invisible but ever present. So again, this kind of brings us back to redlining, right? And I know that today we often talk about the impacts of redlining and perhaps don't realize that it still happens often due to implicit bias. So with Airbnbs and housing loans and things like that. And we can see it in a number of cities, right? So the announcer there mentioned that every city in America is dotted with such sections. So yeah, now I do live in Oakland, but before that I lived in Boston. And in Boston, that's very, very apparent. I was on the train one day and it was right about the time that school got out, and there were a group of black kids who were taking the train along with me uh, through a section called Dorchester. Now, Dorchester is not in the part of Boston where there are all those different universities, the part that people see and the financial stuff. It's really a much more residential area. And what these kids were saying to each other was that, well, one of them in particular was insisting that there was a white part of Dorchester, and all the other kids that they were with did not believe them. And I kind of had to laugh because I'd been to the part of Dorchester that this particular student was talking about. But the awareness was such, and Dorchester is like it is a big neighborhood, right? And it's a very old neighborhood, and it's one that has a lot of black and brown people, right? But it was kind of maddening to see how permanent, I guess, the separation between peoples is even to this day. All right, how persistent perhaps is a better word. All right. So if you're thinking about where you live, right, sometimes we talk about things like Chinatowns and what have you. These are often referred to as ethnic enclaves. So if you're thinking about where you're from, what is your opinion on the ethnic enclaves where you live? Are they a good thing? Are they a bad thing? Let me know. Right. We also do know that in places that have this kind of modern day segregation or separation, if you want, it also kind of follows patterns of vote suppression. So neighborhoods that tend to be blacker and browner, we also see that there are efforts to suppress votes there today. In other parts of our lives, say on the internet, we're seeing the phenomenon of echo chambers, right? And these are places where we really only hear our own kinds of voices reflected back at us. And that's not always a good thing, right? So if we're not hearing the voices of other people, then we kind of end up doubling down on our own thinking. And that's especially dangerous if our own thinking isn't based on good, solid logic and facts. And this gets us into a lot of trouble, as we've seen, right? So January 6th was not that long ago, and there are still people, like just a couple days ago, who were showing up in Texas to because they believed that JFK Jr. was going to come back from the dead. and appear as a certain someone's vice president. So this doesn't happen instantly, right? I think it's easy to paint these people as crazy or silly or stupid. But the fact is, they're vulnerable to the same kinds of things that we are all vulnerable. And unfortunately, from what I can observe, that thinking was not disrupted. They were not able to get into that reflective space, but more into kind of that space that I was talking about before, which is justifying those thoughts and leading to that kind of belief. Another issue that I'm seeing within the US is we act as if we're a homogenous country and a homogenous people. This is not true. If we travel around the country, and to be honest, a lot of Americans don't, we can see very, very quickly that where we're from is not at all the same as where somebody else lives. Are we all Americans in this country? If we're citizens, yeah, of course. But America looks different to everybody, is the point that I'm getting at. And so that's something that we should really learn to embrace. Um, Another way that we see this showing up is in being like quote unquote the only one at work. So often for diversity professionals, sometimes they've applied for these positions, and sometimes it's a position that's kind of been given to them, whether or not they wanted it. And often it's been because they are the only Black or brown person in the office. Right. So this is yet another way of othering people. So if you kind of are thinking about your own company, and if you have a chief diversity officer, well, it's kind of worth looking around at the demographics of your company. Are they the chief diversity officer because it's a role that they wanted and they sought out, or was it something that was kind of given to them without much consent? One moment here, sorry. So what I'd like to pivot to now is right, workplace silos. This is another thing that that can work for or against us, right? And one of the things I thought was interesting about this article is about making workplace silos work for you. So ethnic enclaves are not at all a terrible thing on their own. There are very positive aspects to them. So here in the workplace context, right? So one of the aspects is that they aggregate expertise. They provide the focus and critical mass required to develop expertise on an ongoing basis. Certainly true of some ethnic enclaves we observe today. To assign accountability. They provide boundaries and hierarchy that make it possible to assign accountability. Responsibilities are clearly delineated, objectives are well defined, resources are allocated firmly, and decisions are made and communicated quickly. They also create stability and allow for the development of collective behavioral norms and ways of working. These, in turn, provide a sense of identity, security, psychological safety, and predictability for the people who belong to the silo. So, exactly the same as an ethnic enclave. And sometimes silos are referred to as verticals in the business world. So, verticals serve a clear purpose, especially in today's turbulent environment. We would like to mount a defense. Yes, verticals have undesirable side effects, as do ethnic enclaves sometimes, but the solution is not to dismantle them. To preserve the strengths of the inescapable verticals while minimizing their side effects, organizations should do two things: build bridges between verticals and institute checks and balances. So if you'd like to check that article out, then please check out the link that I'm dropping into the comments here. And another positive example of a silo or an enclave that I like to point out are what's called employee resource groups. So sometimes these can be convened around things like identity. So, like a person like myself, if I'm in a large company that has a lot of other Filipino Americans, we might form an employee resource group that allows us to kind of connect on the basis of that identity. Of course, sometimes it's not based on race or ethnicity. For example, people who have a common background, say in the military, there are sometimes ERGs at different companies for veterans. So if you've been thinking about the potential of an ERG at your workplace, but you're not quite sure, it could be a good thing to have a discussion about, because there are definitely ways that they can be leveraged to help us to get at diversity, or get at equity, excuse me. Right. So, I think after watching that video with all of you, the thing that's really kind of on my mind is, well, it's true that race isn't the cause of crime. I think we've clearly seen that. And if you wanted to think about it in another way, the way that this country was formed, the things that we did to become a rich nation, well, one way of looking at that might be that crime, in fact, is a major motivator for us to reinforce the classifications of race and the negative attributes that we attach to those racial categories. Right. So again, to kind of recap that a little bit, like, who decides what's criminal? Colonists, the early colonists of this country, they saw themselves as they didn't see themselves as foreigners or visitors. They kind of saw themselves as their own sovereign people, and did not see the people who already lived here as a sovereign people of their own. Once again, the British at the time considered the American revolutionaries to be not freedom fighters, but in fact terrorists. And this was a way of disrupting a culture that wasn't working for people, or an economic system more directly that wasn't working for people. And this is a word that we've really latched onto, right? So disruption, especially in the context of tech, but it's worth thinking about who is disrupting what and why, right? Some of the disruption that we've seen in the banking sector has been like cutting of the Glass-Steagall restrictions. This led directly to the 2008 financial crisis. And, well, not that alone, but those disruptive models of banking, they didn't work out so well for us. A lot of social media platforms. I know that a little bit ironic, because I'm on one right now. I'm connected to multiple social media platforms right now, actually. But social media platforms have disrupted how we relate to one another, which is already kind of our social fabric is already weak. And so this disruption has kind of weakened it further, unfortunately. And in my own industry, and people that move in the same circles as myself, right? So DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, and social and racial justice advocates, they often aim to positively disrupt racism and oppression, but there's a lot of disagreement on what that positive disruption means. So a question for us is, how do we know we're disrupting the things that we need to in ways that align in intent and impact? Um, another thing that I was kind of responding to in this video is Dr. Kelley here. He says, you can't tell by looking, right? And he's saying, like, well, criminality is not something that we can observe directly on somebody's skin. It's not a surface level thing, right? Um, and in the years between this video and today, our expectation is that that would have changed. And by and large, it really kind of has not, unfortunately. So to kind of get a better sense of how these dynamics work, I think I want to close by inviting you all to what we call the dignity activity. Right. So if you haven't seen on our social media, we are having one very, very soon, in about half an hour, actually. So if you'd like to register for that, here's the information, and I'll drop links into the chat as well. But if you can't make it today, short notice, I know, we do have another one coming up on December 9th, also from 12 to 2:30 p.m. So I will be dropping those links into the chat very shortly. Um, yeah, let's see. One of the ways that we can be disrupting negative kind of dynamics at work, certainly dynamics of oppression and racism, are looking at what we at All Aces call our core equity opportunities. And for those of you who don't know, those core equity opportunities are knowledge, communication, and relationships. So if we're holding each other at arm's length and really just seeing what's on the outside, well, we are not really furthering our knowledge or deepening it or even sharing it. We are not taking the step to kind of communicate to find out what's underneath that skin. And we are certainly not building relationships with one another. And also that goes back to that story I was telling at the beginning, where somebody was saying, "Oh, Rico, I really forget that you're not white sometimes," meant as a compliment, right? And as my friend got to know me, he got to see that, oh, in fact, we had many similarities. And, I think you can see easily how those three core equity opportunities helped us to kind of get beyond what's on the outside and to see each other as fully human. Anyway, that's all my time for today. I'm dropping those links in the comments here. One for core equity opportunities. That's right there. You can check that out. If you'd like to join us in about half an hour for the dignity activity, you can definitely still come to that. It does start at 12 p.m. Eastern Time and end at 2:30 p.m. And if you can't make it to that, you can still register with plenty of time for our December 9th dignity activity, also from 12 to 2:30 p.m. Anyway, that's it for me for today. Thank you, everybody, for joining me. And I'll see you next time. Bye.